A lot of people suggest that the development of the internet and accompanying factors like social media have had a more profound effect on society than any other technological developments or scientific developments in the last 50 years. Now that's an arguable proposition, but when you look at the number of issues which are touched by the internet, by the social media, the opportunities, but also some of the challenges, whether the worst sort of extremist politics of identity, group crime, which is a problem in this country now, with kids exchanging information on the internet, pornography, fake news. These are issues which touch us all, and touch us all because of the internet. Is there an ethical approach to these issues which the Church has, which enables us to put some of these problems in context and approach them in a very Catholic or Christian or less materialistic way?
I think there are lots of ways in which it challenges us to think through how we can be supportive of people who want to make good ethical choices in the context of an environment that is increasingly determined by internet and by internet associated social media, etc. I think the internet has produced issues of its own that we have to reflect on. But I think probably the thing that I think it has done is it's the realization of the internet in terms of social media has radically changed the environment or the cultural context in which we now have to discuss those issues. And one thing that worries me, that I think we need to recover first, is there's lots of issues that the world has to face and has to look at, some of them which have been maybe highlighted by the internet. But the real problem is we're at a very difficult situation for dialogue in general, because the internet, which the Church at the beginning welcomed very strongly as saying this was something that could allow us to realise, in a sense, the unity of the human family by allowing people to feel closer to each other, to talk to each other, to learn from each other, to dialogue, because the connectivity is there, has in fact very often ended up being something that has seemed to exacerbate the polarisation that is already a feature of our politics. And I think there are two issues within that the Church would want to say and is trying to promote. One is there is the responsibility of the media to be attentive to the accuracy of what they're reporting, because the media still have a privileged role in terms of informing the public. But I think also what the internet has done, it has made most of us are no longer simply consumers of media, but we can in fact be, in a sense, almost producers of media in terms of what we choose to share, the materials, the groups we listen to, how we source materials. And I think one of the things where the Church would be, I think, trying to say is let's try and recover a sense of giving people a sense of agency, of saying to people, don't just be passive in how you respond to the internet. That means first, don't let the mood of some of the conversations dictate your approach. Make a deliberate effort to rise above the tone. Some people have kind of almost said Church people should opt out of social media because the tone is so bad. But in a sense, that's leaving it to the trolls. So one thing we would say is, no, be part of it. Be part of the conversations, but do it differently. And do it differently in a sense by trying to create an environment where there's a respect for the other person, to see the other person as potentially somebody from whom I can learn, rather than somebody to be seen as another or to be beaten. And I think this is where Pope Francis in particular has pushed the idea of trying to create a culture of encounter, which is, I think, fundamentally an attitude. How do I see the person who is different from me? Do I see them somehow as a threat, or as an enemy to be beaten, or as a competitor in a global society? Or do I somehow see the humanity of the other person and respond to that? And from that then will follow, I think, if social media, I think one of the things we played with as trying to propose it was to see social media not just as descriptive, but actually as prescriptive. How could this media be social? It can only be social if we show respect. It can only be social if we're honest in our own expression. It can only be social if we really try to be inclusive and be attentive to the views of others. So I think that's one level at which we try and address the problem of the polarization, the proliferation of fake news, because fake news functions on the basis of the polarization. I'm very happy to take on critically anything that seems to bolster my case rather than looking at it. And I think one thing that I found amazing is that 2002, the Reith lectures, Honora O'Neill spoke about trust and the importance of trust. And she then hit at that stage a very important idea where she said that if we don't maintain honesty in our reporting, and the term she used, it'll poison the wells of public discourse. And I think that's 16 years ago, before the internet and it has happened. And she said that while the social media might seem much more anti-authoritarianism, that also was a risk of becoming anti-democratic. And I think, so two things I think. One is we try and work with other responsible organisations to come up with normative and solutions and values and principles, but more particularly I think as a Catholic Church is to convince people to stay part of it, but do it differently.
It's interesting that in this country, people like Tim Berners-Lee, Nigel Shadbolt, both of them are at this university, clearly believed passionately that the internet was a way in which people would be both liberated because of the extent of knowledge that would become available to them, and brought together in the pursuit of that knowledge. But I think they've been very concerned, particularly in two areas. First of all, by the extent to which the access to information through the internet has been dominated by a few big platforms, which has had an effect on the role of newspapers in society and the way that newspapers conduct themselves now. Secondly, I think they've also been concerned about the extent to which the internet can be used in an authoritarian way and not just in a way to free people up. That we see that happening in China, for example. Presumably, those are issues which the Church has a view on, and presumably they're issues which the Church has tried to respond to when talking about the ethical aspect of the governance of the internet.
Yeah, they've come up for us. We made a choice in the Vatican insofar as part of the group of people who tried to frame thinking to be positive about the internet, to underscore the positive and the potential dimensions of the internet to create this sense of the unity of the global family where people would exchange information. I think probably the people you've mentioned there, also coming out of an academic environment, had similar aspirations. I think, though, we have to be, certainly one thing that we picked up then was from a number of German academics who invited us to be much more critically aware of the influence of the political and economic context in which the internet was being developed, and particularly the role of the big platforms, the big companies, who, there's a very interesting scholar called Tristram Harris who had worked with Google, who essentially says that the way the platforms make their money, very often in offering free services, is by holding the attention of the people who come on the platform. And the more you hold their attention, the more information you're potentially gathering about them and the more possibilities you have to send them advertising. So he said it's really a competition to have the attention of people. And he said in that began to, what materials will hold people? How do I keep them? And unfortunately, it seems it's almost like a race to the bottom. I think he uses the term the race to the bottom of the brainstem. It's the more basic, simplistic, less noble material that seems to hold people. And therefore, in a sense, rather than liberating people from prejudice and from bias, feeds it back into them because it holds them and it keeps them there. And certainly the governance issue, I think, is a huge one. Because all these companies choose their jurisdictions. They can move and choose, and they're not tied by national law. Also, the speed of the change has been such that it's very difficult for any parliament to keep up the speed. By the time they address the problem, the issue has moved on. I think the United Nations is polarized to an extent that it can't really take address. But the one hopeful model, I think, is, and again, it's people like the those who developed the internet set up a thing called ICANN, which was basically to do the numbers and registrations and the codes that make the internet work, that control all the models of how you distribute internet names and domain names, how the verification happens. So the hard wiring that makes the internet a language that works throughout the world. And that was very much a voluntary organization with the stakeholders, with the companies, with the scientists. And I think we have to think more about that model. I think one of the big issues is that a lot of the people is to keep the internet one, where some countries want to create their own internet, separate internet, where they can be more in control. And I think it's a balancing act for people there. How can we keep it one and yet not give in to attempts at censorship?
I think it's absurd that some political commentators have suggested in this country and in America that the internet, that these great big giant companies, mainly based in California, don't have an impact on politics, given that the whole of their economic model, their commercial model, is based on knowing how people will react, or thinking they know how people will react, and then encouraging them to act in particular ways for commercial reasons. That's presumably the basis of their algorithms. So I think we've been quite naive about the impact of the internet on people's political choices.
Yeah, I think that's clear. I think the other one that's interesting now is that the companies, the internet companies, legitimately and properly, I think, taking account of the monster they have created, particularly in terms of fake news. But some of the efforts to come back to how they're going to respond to that is looking for more algorithms that will somehow sort it out. But those algorithms will reflect the values and thinking and mindset of the big companies, which in some cases will be noble, but in other cases may or may not be. But what gives them that authority to be the ultimate determinant of what will be passed as legitimate news and what not? I think there again, for the church, there's a huge challenge, which is to think about one of our biggest activities globally is education. And I think we really have to rethink our models of education. We have to focus more, I think, on helping people, not so much on accessing the information, because they can do that, not so much on processing the information, but actually on developing criteria of judgment, of learning how to reason and reflect. And there's an interesting piece by an American archbishop who makes the point that the internet of its nature is visual, it's speedy, it's emotional, and it's calling for immediate responses. Whereas he said good thinking and good reflection takes time, requires a certain logical analysis, requires silence. And he would argue that one of the things we need to look at in our colleges and universities, how we help people to be not just processors of information, but able to form judgment, to make discernment, to be critical readers and interpreters and protagonists in the internet.
I very strongly agree with that. There has been an argument, as you know, that universities, that teaching have been mooked out of existence, whereas it seems to me that you need better teaching and a much more assertive approach to trying to teach people the difference between right and wrong, between falsehood and truth, and that those have always been and still are at the root of a good education. You don't have to read Cardinal Newman to actually realise that. But there is another aspect which concerns me, which is the relationship between these new platforms, as we call them, for news, with their algorithms, and public service broadcasting, because you would think that that what's been happening is an even stronger argument for public service broadcasting, with decisions made about news by people who are responsible to other sentient human beings who are themselves responsible to a broader society. Whereas in fact you see public broadcasting in every country, United States, United Kingdom and elsewhere, shriveling because of lack of support from governments, even more than support from the public.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that one. I think it's also almost like a product of if some of the platforms have been successful by identifying a type of content that draws the attention of people, and that sadly some public broadcasters have gone into competition with them rather than saying we have to try and hold a different standard, or we maybe try and maintain that commitment that I think was at the heart of the original beginning of the BBC, to educate as well. Yeah. Not just to entertain, but to educate. And without, that sounds quite paternalistic, and it sounds quite old-fashioned.
There's something to be said for paternalism occasionally.
but I think there's another thing that maybe, and it came up in Pope Francis when he talked about the environment, and I think it has something to do also with the maybe the more cultural environment, which is in a society where there are very few common narratives, where we don't share certain views, we don't have the same understanding of history, we don't look together to shared futures. The real question is, how do you educate? Because Newman had a great understanding of education because he had a vision of the type of person and who would be happy, who would be fulfilled, who would flourish, who would bring goodness to society.
Used a very old-fashioned word, gentleman.
Gentleman, yes. But I think one of the problems we have nowadays is we've had a lot of, within our intellectual climate, a lot of what we might call postmodernism, which is about, in a sense, being skeptical about all the truth claims. I don't think we should be surprised if fake news was born also in that context. I'm not saying that we can come back to easy agreement, but I do think we need to come back to an idea of looking at what it means to be human. And Pope Francis, as I say, on this talk on our physical environments and ecology, says you can't ultimately engage meaningful without asking the questions about, well, what is a good life? What are the values that help people to flourish in community? What are the things that give people meaning and purpose and hope? And I think they're the questions that we can't avoid, because they will also the questions. Now, we have to have that debate maybe in the past with our traditional natural law thinking, which tried to do that, was a little overly Western and didn't take account of different views and was maybe the perspective of one privilege. But as a method of saying, we try and think together as human beings about what it is that makes life worthwhile, about what is enough, what is sufficient, rather than being trapped in a kind of view almost that we're always searching for more. I think somehow universities have to be willing to look at those issues again.
I'm very conscious of the strengthening, alas, of identity politics in the last few years, which the great Lebanese, French, Arab, Christian novelist Armin Malouf calls the panthers that we have to face up to these days. And the way in which the social media encourages people to have single issue tribal loyalties, which can sometimes be racist, which can sometimes be just extremely nationalist, which I suppose you see as well in some of the evangelical Christians in the United States. I saw an evangelical Christian pastor the other day talking about God's foreign policy in relation to the Old Testament and Israel. Is there a sense in which the Catholic Church, Christian churches, should be using the internet and social media to promote a greater sense of loyalty to the ethical issues on which we feel strongly?
Yeah, I think that is a kind of a thing that can be important. I had one example of that in the United States, where I was asked in an interview about the Pope and the Pope's presence in social media. Next thing, the contrast was being brought to the President Trump's use of social media. And I think one of the things that I think that we had to get across there was that the Pope has long been talking about and tweeting about the importance of building bridges, of building understanding across people. And the person interviewing me was kind of suggesting that this somehow was a response to Trump's desire to build walls. And you had to kind of say, no, this predates that. But equally, he's not going to stop saying it because it may not be well received in certain quarters politically. That I think one of the things that for the church it's important is not to be chasing or responding to the negative, but try and build a positive, to offer kind of hopeful resources to people, to offer them the broader vision, to invite people to let go of the fear. Because I think the identity politics thing is, a lot depends then on leaders. Do you stroke that to for your own benefit? Do you play up the tribe, or do you rise above?
And you always need the other to react against.
Yeah, I have got to tell a little story against myself. I grew up in a small town about 30 miles from Dublin, and there was a small Protestant school. And we were walking past the school in the mornings on our way to school down the road, and we began shouting, "Prodigogs, prodigogs," at the children in the school. My parents nearly murdered me when they heard about this. They were furious, and rightly so. But this is somehow, they were different. They were in a different school. They were down the road, and there was, you didn't, as a child, you didn't know, but you were on the route to bad values insofar as there was nothing physical, but there was this abusive. That school closed, nothing to do with our behaviour, thankfully, but it closed for lack of numbers. Suddenly, a new thing developed was I was attending a school run by the Loretto sisters, but we also had to pass a school run by the Mercy sisters. So we just simply changed the slogan and began screaming, "Mercy Gogs, Mercy Gogs." and I said, left me with a feeling that somehow identity is often something we develop in terms of being different. As an Irishman, very quickly, I wouldn't, not nationalist. But if somebody says to me, "Oh, you're English," no, I'm not. And it's a weird kind of thing that we have this thing that we need the other to develop a sense of identity. I think we grow beyond that, and we see that a proper identity is actually to learn the commonalities of our stories, even people who are very different. But you learn about our shared humanity, and I think that's where the Pope is trying to encourage people to encounter, to actually meet the other person, let them surprise you. In fact, you'll learn more about yourself in a good encounter with somebody who is different.
Let me finish up with a rather prosaic question. You're aware of, as a lay Catholic, of the variety of websites that you use. For example, you want to go to church on Sunday in a town that you don't know. You find out on the internet the name of the Catholic Church. You see the services, and sometimes it's all done very professionally, and sometimes it's not. How much do you think that the Catholic Church at the diocesan or parish level has actually got the internet, and the way in which the internet can be used to communicate important messages or lessons? Is that a process which is, to use a cliche, work in progress? Is it something which you, in your role with the social communications and with culture, have been actively trying to promote? What's being done to make the church more digitally friendly and able to take initiatives?
I'd say, yes, it is a work, hopefully in progress, but it's certainly not finished.
And going better in places like Germany than... And
going better in some places than others. And I mean, going from very sophisticated arrangements where when you walk into the parish and you have if you've enabled your phone in some diocese, you will immediately have an app from the diocese, and it immediately alerts you to the parish you're in and what's available and what might be happening.
Really?
And in a sense, other places where they'd have a very strong sense of being able to build a sense of community. So they ask people early on to give their email is outdated, but even sometimes sign up to an app, and they keep them informed and they keep them
Email's
updated.
outdated, is it? I mean,
well, email is not seen as necessarily, because you get so many things in your email, you may or may not be attentive to them. The diocese, so Los Angeles is a place where they've brought in a very distinguished social media manager, a guy who had worked in the entertainment business, who knew it well, and is bringing that, but with thinking through, though, not just doing it in terms of a business model, but also thinking through the sense, how can we build a better sense of community and belonging? So there are some great stories. I would say it's very mixed, it's up and down, and it reflects, I'd say also it reflects the fact that our churches, particularly in our parts of the world, are very often, the young are not very present. For the young are present, some of this will follow automatically. The other thing I think is that I was again last year at something in the United States where somebody said, well, McDonald's wouldn't leave it to each restaurant. They'd have the big app and then everybody feeds into it and you can have a kind of a branding and a marketing. And, you know, but I think that model would be a mistake because that is then, McDonald's is essentially the same wherever you go. You want your local church to be different, to reflect the community it's in, to reflect the language it's working in, to reflect the traditions. And even parishes can differ within the one town and people will make choices based on that. So I think we'd want to avoid the kind of bland global, and we probably do it badly anyway. But it's better, I think, to, at the same time, what we're trying to do is encourage people to engage and to use at the local level. A lot of that would be voluntary, and you get the great one, which is somebody comes in, sets up a lovely website, has all the features, and then it hasn't been updated for 3 years. And it's happened to me last year. I found myself standing outside a church where the Mass at 9 o'clock wasn't happening. So and I used that. But, yes. You know, the one interesting one that we're trying to think a little bit about is that social media at its best is interactive. It's not just one-way broadcasting. We've been very addicted to one-way broadcasting. We preach, we use microphones, we use radios, and one of the big platforms we have at the moment is the Pope when he tweets. Reaches a huge number of people. The sad thing is, well, you couldn't legitimately expect the Pope to respond to those who respond, but there's a huge response when the Pope tweets. And what we're trying to do is to encourage parishes to respond. So somebody comes on and says, I'm worried about my daughter, I'm really upset about somebody who died, or I'm confused. Somebody would maybe take it to respond.
More work for parish priests.
Not for parish priests, no, lay people. This is for this, and I'm convinced that, in fact, the importance of the lay people in the life of the church is actually, theologically, we've recognised it for a while, but I think what's happened digitally will force us to be more realistic in that.
Bishop Tighe, thank you very much indeed for those illuminating thoughts. I much enjoyed the conversation.
Great, and thank you.
Nice to have you
thank
here
you very much. Thank you. God bless.